Joining us on Troopathon today is former United Nations Ambassador John Bolton, one of the country's leading foreign policy experts and a rumored presidential candidate. And we are very honored to have you here with us today. Thank you, Mr. Bolton. We appreciate it.
Glad to be here in person this time.
Yes, over our previous years, you've joined us by phone. And of course, the purpose of our Troopathon has been, since its inception 3 years ago, has been to support our troops and their missions wherever they are, whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever hostile territory they may be in. And we appreciate the support that you've shown us.
Well, we appreciate what they're doing in defense of our country. This is critical work in incredibly dangerous circumstances. They're putting their lives on the line for us, and it's the least we can do to show our support.
How effective would you say that the United Nations is right now in controlling some of the hostile states like Iran?
Well, I think the UN record overall is pretty pathetic, in part because it's a group of member states, and you're never going to get a policy more effective than the lowest common denominator. And I think that's one reason why, as we debate inside the United States what our policy should be, we have to decide what's in our national interest. We have to take action based on what we think is necessary to protect those interests, certainly with allies when we can, but we never want to be in a position where we go to the UN Security Council or any other part of the UN system to ask, Mother, may I take steps necessary for our national defense?
We're looking at a very volatile situation in the Middle East and in the North Africa region right now. Do you anticipate that there might be actual U.S. forces fighting either a Cold War or a hot war?
Well, I think that we're in a position now in the case of Iraq as the President draws down our troops and as we think about the prospect of drawdowns in Afghanistan, that our friends in the region already think that the U.S. presence is diminishing, that our role is weakening, and that the commitment, the long-term commitment of the United States has been called into question. So even as the democratic demonstrations in the Middle East have spread and regimes have come under criticism by their own citizens, exactly what our role is going to be, I think, remains uncertain. I would hope that we could avoid direct involvement on the ground, except when there are key American strategic interests involved. There have been and there are in Iraq and Afghanistan. There may be in other cases as well. But this is not a general campaign to promote democracy. What we have to insist on is that American interests are threatened and that we're prepared to defend them.
You know, a lot of people are commenting on the lack of action that has come out of this administration by President Obama. 33 days, and well, it'll be a number of days, that a long time, it seems, to the American people before action was actually taken when it comes to what was happening in Libya and some of these other countries. How does that make our troops' job that much more difficult?
I think it makes it far more difficult. This is not just a question of waiting for international support for a particular mission. It's not a question of making sure the U.S. isn't criticized for being in the lead. By failing to act early and decisively in Libya, we lost the opportunity perhaps to tip the balance against Muammar Gaddafi, who has had a terrorist past. He has killed Americans in cold blood. And if he were to prevail in the struggle in Libya today, he would almost certainly return to his support for international terrorism, and I think almost certainly return to his efforts to get nuclear and chemical weapons, which would pose direct threats to the United States and our friends and allies in the Middle East and in Europe. So by not acting quickly, the President lost a real opportunity.
Under the former administration, President George W. Bush spoke and advocated very eloquently, as you did, about the need for victory in Iraq, and one of the reasons that was articulated so passionately was because there might be a novel concept that we could spread democracy in many of these other Middle Eastern countries. And yet, when we had this precious opportunity, and when it became apparent after much ridicule of the former administration that was the potential was there, that people were rising up and speaking out for democracy, it seemed to slide through our fingers.
Well, I think we're getting ready to squander it again in Iraq, in part because we have not stood up to Iran. A lot of people argued that actually we went after the wrong regime by overthrowing Saddam Hussein. I don't happen to agree with that. I think Saddam was a threat to international peace and security in our interest. It just, in that unfortunate circumstance, there was another threat right behind him in the form of Iran, which is and has been for some number of years the world's central banker for international terrorism, and it's been pursuing quite successfully a nuclear weapons capability. I don't think that we spent enough attention dealing with the threat of Iran after overthrowing Saddam Hussein, and I think now, as the prospect of American forces leaving Iraq comes nearer, that the threat that Iran poses in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the other Arab countries of the Arabian Peninsula is now something that puts us at much greater risk than we were before.
Two-part question. Did we achieve victory in Iraq, and should we continue to stay in Iraq beyond what President Obama has suggested?
Well, I think the critical victory was in overthrowing Saddam Hussein. That regime was a threat to us and our friends in the region. Had he gotten free of UN weapons inspectors and UN sanctions, there's no doubt he would have returned to his weapons of mass destruction. He had kept 1,000 nuclear scientists and technicians together. He had called them his nuclear mujahideen. This was the core of a new nuclear program. By overthrowing Saddam, what we should have done, I think, was immediately turn control of the country back over to the Iraqi people. I think by stretching out our authority, we impeded the political maturation of the Iraqi people. I hope they've overcome that now, but as I say, I'm very worried about the internal threat posed by Iran. I think we should keep American forces in Iraq, not to govern the country, not to police the country, but to be there as a source of stability, not only in Iraq, but for other friends and allies in the region. And the President's commitment to withdraw by the end of this year, I think, risks squandering everything that our brave young men and women in uniform have gained for us at great cost to them and their families.
Let's shift our attention for a moment to Afghanistan and what's happening on the ground there and the war on terror and how it relates to Homeland Security, because the President did make an argument that we should be in Afghanistan, and that was the good war, quote unquote. Now, whenever we have troops in harm's way, obviously we want the best possible outcome. Are we doing that now? Are we guaranteeing, or is this administration doing all it can for our troops there?
Well, I think the administration made the correct decision to increase U.S. and other NATO forces in Afghanistan. I think that the situation required that. I think that they've had considerable success in their military operations. But even as the President was announcing the need to increase forces in Afghanistan, he coupled it in the very same speech with a commitment to begin substantial withdrawals in the summer of 2011. And that was a signal to al-Qaeda and the Taliban that if they were only patient enough, the advantage could return to them. I think that endangered Americans in Afghanistan and risks undercutting the very substantial successes we've had. We have two main interests in Afghanistan. One is to prevent the country from falling again under the hands of the Taliban and being used as a base for international terrorism, such as we suffered on 9/11.
Yes.
But there's an additional objective, and that's to prevent instability in Afghanistan from spilling over into Pakistan and destabilizing that country, which has a nuclear arsenal. It's been reported in the press of between 60 and 200 nuclear weapons. This is a new strategic objective since 9/11. It also requires a lot of hard work with the government of Pakistan. But the work that our troops are doing in Afghanistan is absolutely critical, not only for that country, but to avoid the catastrophic danger of Pakistan's nuclear weapons getting into the hands of international terrorists.
What countries have you visited recently, and what have you learned?
Well, I've been out to the Arabian Peninsula. I've been to a number of countries there since the demonstrations broke out in the Middle East. I've traveled in Asia, was in Japan 3 days before the earthquake.
Oh, good grief. Welcome home.
I'm glad to be back. And, but I do try and travel extensively because it's important to see what's happening even in relatively brief trips, to talk to people that I've worked with before, media and opinion leaders, and to get their ideas of the dangers that they face.
In your assessment, what do you think is the single biggest threat to our troops' morale in the hot wars that we're fighting right now?
Well, I'm very concerned that the President has not, in a very public way, explained and defended the American commitments in places like Iraq and Afghanistan.
We never hear him talk about it at all.
And it's no wonder that American public opinion, according to the polls, is turning against these struggles. That, to me, is a failure of presidential leadership. Most Americans are very sensible. They don't worry about faraway places. They tend to the interests that they have, their family, their work, their neighborhood, all perfectly understandable. They expect that the President will be the one watching out for American national interest. And when the President sees a threat, he explains it, he defends the course of conduct he wants to pursue, and Americans tend to support that because that's the job they've delegated to the President. When he's not explaining why we're in Iraq, why we're in Afghanistan, when he gives every indication he feels uncomfortable about using American power to protect American citizens, it's no wonder we find difficulty in support for the troops that are carrying out these very difficult missions.
And in all fairness, many of us have observed that the Bush administration, former president, did not articulate his position as well as possibly could have been done at the time. You certainly did. You were out there talking from the United Nations quite extensively. But it is important for us to maintain our position of leadership in the world, although some may disagree. But I think any rational thinking American knows that communication and leadership on these very dangerous times is critically important.
I think that's a very important role for the American president. And I'll tell you something, even looking at developments in the Middle East, people say, well, we don't want to do anything to antagonize this group or that group. The fact is, I've seen this dozens of times in my career. The United States takes a position and it receives some public criticism, but the very foreign leaders who criticize you in public tell you privately, you know, I had to do that for my own domestic political reasons, but I really support what you're doing. So I think that's why we have to make our decisions on the basis of what's best for America. And then try and persuade others about it, but not wait for them to approve what we think we need to do.
All right, well, I'm going to have one last fun question for you here. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has announced that she's not interested in a second term. Would you be willing to take over for her?
Well, I'm not expecting any phone calls from the Obama administration, but we'll see what happens on that score.
And on the score of potential presidential run, is this something that you're serious about?
Well, I'm thinking about it because I don't think the President has done an adequate job of making national security a priority in our national political discourse. And I think it's important for people to have the opportunity to understand what's at stake for America as challenges and adversaries rise around the world. We have to have confidence that we've got a president who's going to defend American interest, who isn't apologetic about it, and is prepared to make the hard decisions. That's the kind of real president we need.
We have had a number of very famous people on this broadcast, and we're going to have more people who have been involved in show business, Rush Limbaugh and Mark Levin and Sean Hannity, and all of these people have come together, as well as from Hollywood, Gary Sinise and Kelsey Grammer. All of these people have joined together for one cause, and now we have a policymaker such as yourself who has been involved in this arena. I call it the sausage-making arena. And I'd like to know one last thought that you would have for our troops out there who are in harm's way and for whom we are trying to raise money to not only provide care packages for, but also to take care of the wounded when they come back to the United States.
Well, I think they should know how much the American people honor them and respect them. And they shouldn't really pay so much attention to the vagaries of what politicians are saying. The overwhelming majority of the American people support them, support their mission, and want to look after them and their families.
Ambassador, it's been a very deep honor to have you on our show today.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Glad
you.
to be here.